So let's start thinking about consciousness a bit, what we mean by consciousness. Consciousness, and it's the one thing we cannot deny, is the fact that we are conscious. It's probably the only absolute certainty we have, is that we are experiencing beings. I mean, right now, for example, we could all be plugged into the Matrix and just be having this wonderful simulated experience of sitting here in this room. So we could actually doubt whether this is real. But we couldn't doubt that we were still experiencing. It may be an illusion, but we're still experiencing. In fact, that's what Descartes saw with his famous cogito ergo sum. He was looking for the absolute truth. And he found he could doubt everything, any idea, any philosophy. He even doubted he had a body. He doubted his experience. And this is 350 years before virtual reality. And then he realized the one thing he couldn't doubt was that he was experiencing. And yet this is something which science has consistently ignored for various reasons. I mean, one is Descartes himself. Descartes said he didn't want to get himself burnt at the stake like Bruno got when Bruno supported Copernicus. So he said, let us natural philosophers, they didn't call themselves scientists, they called themselves natural philosophers, we will study the world of things, the world of things in space. The world of the mind we'll leave to the church. We don't want to tread on their toes. So it was like a sort of safety net to stop himself getting burnt. He said, we'll leave the mind to the church. So that began the split. But also, of course, there's no way to measure consciousness. You can't weigh it. You can't use normal scientific ways of looking at things to measure consciousness, which actually leads to the interesting corollary, the fact that there is no scientific evidence whatsoever for consciousness because there's no way of measuring it. There's no actual experiment we can do to prove that somebody is conscious. We believe they are. We may all be, other people may all be what's called zombies in philosophical language. Zombie is actually a technical philosophical term. You probably don't realize that. A zombie is someone who looks like a human being, acts like a human being in all ways, and even says, I'm a conscious human being, but actually has no consciousness inside. That's the philosophical definition of a zombie. And there is no scientific experiment you can do to determine whether somebody is a zombie or a real conscious entity. There is no scientific evidence for consciousness. And yet we know it. And also science is interested in the objective, the real world, and consciousness is subjective. Science is looking for the truths which are common to all observers, that everybody can agree upon, is actually independent of the observer. And consciousness is clearly very variable according to the observers. That's another reason science doesn't want to touch consciousness. And the third is, well, the fourth, is that the universe works perfectly well without any understanding of consciousness. We don't need consciousness to explain the universe. And in fact, you get this sort of rather interesting paradox here that science would be much happier if there weren't such a thing as consciousness. And yet without consciousness, there wouldn't be any science. So there's this strange paradox. So things are beginning to change a bit these days, though. Partly, as we've touched upon already, quantum physics. Various things in quantum physics implicate consciousness, the observer in some way. All the work that's been going on in the recent decades to do with the brain, neurophysiology, neuropsychology are all beginning to bring up this question of what is consciousness. We can't deny or can't ignore the fact we're conscious any longer. And of course, in the current times, there's this whole interest in society, in the mind, in personal development, in spiritual growth, which again is all around consciousness, the nature of consciousness. So what I want to start off by doing is actually looking, what do we actually mean by consciousness? What is consciousness? Because we use the word in many different ways in our culture. It's a bit like, the Eskimos have 20 words for snow because they have all these different meanings for snow, and we just talk about snow or sleet or something. It's the same with consciousness. We just use the word consciousness. We mean many different things. You go to Sanskrit and you'll find about a dozen different words for consciousness, meaning a dozen different clearly delineated aspects of what we loosely call consciousness. So what do we mean when we say that somebody's conscious? Just look at some of the different meanings. I mean, the first obvious one is somebody who's awake is conscious. We say somebody who's asleep is not conscious. But we dream when we're asleep. We have experiences. Dreams happen in consciousness. So what we really mean when we say a person isn't conscious asleep, we mean they're not conscious of the exterior world, usually, but they're still conscious of their interior world. So there's still consciousness. Or sometimes we talk about conscious, I wasn't conscious of what I was doing, I mean, I wasn't paying attention. But there's still some consciousness there. An experience many of you, I'm sure, have had many times is driving down a familiar road, perhaps driving home at night, and you suddenly realize you weren't conscious of the last 2 miles. And yet clearly you were conscious, because if you weren't conscious at all, you've been driving into trees and trucks and you wouldn't be there. You were conscious, but what we probably mean there is much of my attention was on what I'm going to do when I get home, or what that awful thing that happened to me earlier in the day was, or what I'm planning for my vacation. It's like your consciousness is taken up with other stuff, so just minimal consciousness is on the road, but enough to get you through. Another use today is spirituality. We talk about a conscious person. Oh, that's a really conscious person. You know, that person's really unconscious. You know, the leaders of our countries are really not very conscious people. All countries, probably. They're just as they're conscious. You know, talk about a more conscious person. What we really mean is, the more spiritual person is conscious of certain things, maybe certain levels of reality. The person we call, quote, unconscious is maybe just more conscious about their bank accounts or whatever. But it's just conscious in different ways. And then there's the one which scientists often come up with, is that human beings are conscious and other creatures aren't conscious. I'm sure you've heard that many times. You can read it all over the place. Human beings are the only conscious creature on this planet. Now, to me, you look at a dog. I love dogs. One of my favorite creatures, dogs and dolphins, and actually most mammals, but dogs in particular. You know, a dog seems to dream when it's asleep. We see it twitching its legs, its nose quivering. We imagine it's chasing an imaginary cat or something, or whatever. Although if you think about it, when we chase something, you know, that we can hardly move our arms and legs in dreams. Perhaps the dog's having the same thing. It's trying to chase this cat, but it's like, oh. The very fact we give dogs anesthetics when we operate on them, I find interesting. If we didn't believe they were conscious, why would we bother to make them unconscious? If you think about it. So, although we say dogs aren't conscious, we clearly believe they are if we give them an anesthetic. What we're really talking about here is self-awareness. When people say only humans are conscious, what they mean is only humans have an awareness of their own consciousness. They're self-aware. Whether that's true or not, we don't know, but that's what they mean. But clearly, dogs are experiencing beings. What I mean by consciousness is a much more general thing. It's like awareness, the very fact that we have experience. It's the capacity for experience, whether that's dreamlike, fantasy, whether it's intelligent, spiritual thoughts, whatever. It's the capacity for experience. And I distinguish these because you could say, on the one hand, there's the forms that arise in consciousness, all the different thoughts, perceptions, images that arise. And then there's the space. Buddhists often talk about consciousness as space. It's the space within which all experience arises. And an analogy that's often used for this is like the light in a projector. The light inside every projector, whether it's this projector here, film projector, slide projector, in the center of the projector is white light, undifferentiated light, light of all colors, which then shines through a slide onto a screen, and we get an image on the screen. And then we get caught up in the image. If it's a movie, we get caught up in the story. We start thinking it's real. We start sweating or laughing or whatever it is. We get totally immersed in what's happening on the screen, and we forget it's all just light.